What I'm going to be discussing today is the Gwangju Democratic Revolution of May 1980 in Gwangju, South Korea. The Gwangju Democratic Revolution is more popularly known as the Gwangju Uprising. It was the tipping point for the push for democracy in South Korea. This enormous event is little known outside the country, yet it is a crucial moment in Korean-U.S. relations as the Carter administration is accused of complicity in the massacre of hundreds of civilians and the wounding of thousands more. My presentation today is based on ongoing research I have been conducting for over a year, and it may never be finished. Here you can see on the map, Gwangju is in the southwestern part of Korea. It's 166 miles from the capital, Seoul, and 275 from Pyongyang in North Korea, for those of you who are North Korea watchers. So in the fall of 1979, the stability of the Korean government was upset when dictator Park Chung-hee was assassinated by the head of the Korean CIA. A weak interim president was installed. The U.S. government had some influence in Korea as it had troops and diplomats there. And General John Wickham had operational control of joint American and Korean forces. When Chun assumed control of the Korean military on December 12th, Wickham and William Gleistein, the American ambassador to Korea, raised no objections. The American government had helped to install an authoritarian government structure in South Korea after World War II, so this attitude was not surprising. Declassified documents show that the American government was aware that Chun's power play was unpopular with the citizens of South Korea. The Carter administration was also aware that Chun had mobilized troops from the special forces quickly as early as February as a reaction against the citizens' unrest. We can see here that there was good communication between the Americans and the Koreans. Through the Freedom of Information Act, freelance journalist Tim Shark gained access to thousands of Carter administration documents that pertain to South Korea and the Gwangju Uprising. In the memo presented here, Ambassador Gleistein writes to the Secretary of State on May 9th that he has discussed the use of military force in Gwangju. He says that Chun probably found his attitude sympathetic, and he feels the authorities have found a sensible and prudent approach to the student problem and are very aware of the danger of overreaction and the use of military force. Protests broke out, mostly led by students at universities. Student protests had become a norm in Korea since 1919. Chun worried these protests would become nationwide and the authoritarian government would be in danger of being overthrown in early May. He began to plan means to suppress any students who led or took part in protests. Declassified documents show that the Carter administration was aware of what was going on and did not raise strong objections to Chun's plan to shore up the police with military troops. While citizen protests were peaceful, the United States urged Korea to find a political solution rather than to use the military. The U.S. did warn that using the military could bring severe consequences, but did not tell the Koreans point blank that they should not do it. Gleistein later claimed that he had no idea the Korean government would crack down so hard on the students. Yet he indicates that he understands the military could be used to supplement the police force. He calls the student protests a problem, which also suggests that he believed his sympathy for the government's position was warranted. At no time did Gleistein send anyone to report firsthand on the situation. The report he got from Gwangju eventually came days later, once things had begun to turn violent. As students protested peacefully in Seoul, Gwangju, and other cities, Chun determined to stop them. Wickham and Gleistein urged caution, but did not make any formal objection to Chun's desire to suppress the students or to call in paratroopers. On May 17th, Chun declared martial law throughout the entire country. He closed all schools and universities and dissolved the National Assembly. The next morning, students and faculty gathered at the gates of Cheonnam National University, demanding to be let in to hold classes. Police pushed them into downtown Gwangju and then claimed they were unable to control the crowds as other citizens joined the peaceful protest. When the police got violent, some students threw rocks at them. Paratroopers were sent in who used violence to suppress the protesters. This is the beginning of a military operation cruelly titled Splendid Holiday. Through hundreds of photographs and videos, the few journalists left in Gwangju during the uprising documented what Chun denied later. The peaceful protests of the people were met with the violence of the military. Students barred from university classes demonstrate peacefully at Cheonam National University gates on May 18th. City police were unable to control the crowd, so the military dispatched a special forces unit trained for assault missions to quell the protest. The troopers used tear gas, batons, and rubber bullets to put down the uprising, but still workers, shopkeepers, and parents took to the streets to defend their children. Then the military opened fire, killing dozens of people and wounding hundreds more. These photographs are just two of the many that corroborate witness testimony. Soldiers often pulled workers out of shops and offices and beat them. Sometimes they stripped men down to their underwear before loading them into trucks and taking them to prison or other unknown places. And you can see here in these photographs, the one on the left shows a man begging for his life, and on the right we see a group of men who were running in the street, forced by soldiers, and who are in their underwear. With telephone lines cut and media outlets unable to broadcast, the citizens of Gwangju were cut off from the rest of the country and the world. A few journalists were able to get stories out through Japan and Germany. The Gwangju citizens were unaware. On May 20th, having had enough of the military's brutality, Gwangju citizens fought back by taking caches of arms from stores and workplaces, setting some buildings on fire, and pushing the troops back. Around 7 p.m., taxi and bus drivers banded together and drove their vehicles so the army couldn't get down the main thoroughfares. By the end of the day on the 21st, after the streets were littered with bodies, shoes, clothes, spent shells, and blood, mostly belonging to the citizens, Chun pulled the military back in an effort to regroup and to plan to retake the city. And if you've seen the movie A Taxi Driver that came out in 2017, that tells the story of the Gwangju Uprising, and in particular you will see scenes of the taxi drivers and the bus drivers blocking the roads. This photograph you see is the citizens who are gathered around a central fountain in front of the provincial office building, which was sort of the hub, the headquarters for the protesters. And if you look carefully at this photograph, you will see there is no violence of any kind. They're sitting there peacefully. Again, without any first-hand knowledge, Gleistein cabled DC and claimed rioters were reported to be firing on helicopters overhead. No witness who was in Gwangju during the uprising has ever reported rioting of any kind taking place. The claim of rioters was created by Chun's government to justify their actions. The paratroopers used helicopters to shoot down citizens on the roofs of office buildings. Chun has denied this since 1980. Even now in 2020, he is on trial for defaming a priest who gave witness testimony in which he described seeing victims shot and killed by soldiers from helicopters. And in fact, just this week, Chun was back in court and the prosecutors have asked that he be put in prison for 18 months. He's about, I think he's 82 or 83 years old, so 18 months in prison could almost be the same as a life sentence for him. If you take a moment and read this cable from Ambassador Gleistein to Washington, D.C., remember that Gleistein relied on Chun's people for what he was being told and what he was saying, and what he says here is actually just not true. This is a list of people who attended a policy review committee meeting on May 22nd, 1980 at 4 p.m. in the afternoon at the White House. Notice that Mr. Brzezinski, who was National Security Advisor, said, In the short term, support; in the longer term, pressure for political evolution. Now, what this means is that he was saying that the United States should support Chun's government and their decision to send the troops into Gwangju, and that after the event was over, then there should be discussion about political evolution to democracy. You can see in these two statements that there is contradictory information. On the 22nd of May in 1980, General Wickham accepted and agreed to the request by the Korean government to allow the use of certain selected Korean armed forces. But in 1989, a U.S. State Department white paper claimed that the U.S. had neither authority over nor prior knowledge of the movement of the Special Warfare Command units to Gwangju, which, of course, we now know is just not true. In the years subsequent to the uprising, all of the American actors involved have died with two exceptions. President Carter is 96 years old and is in failing health. He has yet to explain or discuss why his administration made their decisions, or to explain why he was absent from the meetings and was not copied nor directly addressed in any of the related documents. Gleistein and Wickham wrote autobiographies that discuss the uprising. Gleistein freely admits his knowledge of what happened was second and third hand. Wickham's story is contradicted or called into question by the unclassified documents. And I, in fact, have written to President Carter and to General Wickham asking about the Gwangju Uprising and their role, and neither of them has returned my request. Ambassador Gleistein's interpretation of how and why the U.S. decided to acquiesce the requisition strongly suggests that he and General Wickham were conscious of their substantial authority and consulted each other in earnest. And this is the interpretation of Samsun Lee, who is a scholar of these issues. Mount St. Helens erupted on May 18th and was a disaster. Rightly, it was determined that the president should visit. He flew out on May 21st and returned to D.C. on May 22nd. May 22nd, the day his administration made the decision to allow the release of Korean forces from the Joint Command to go to Gwangju. And remember, I showed you in a previous slide that the meeting was at 4 p.m. on the 22nd. President Carter was back in D.C. within a few hours of that, and there's no explanation for why he didn't speak to any of the committee members prior to the meeting, nor is there explanation for why they didn't wait so he could attend the meeting. His diary for the 22nd shows he didn't speak to anyone on the committee at all that day. And on the 23rd, there is one comment, and I believe this is Secretary Muskie's note prior to a breakfast that he attended with the president on the 23rd. He says, "Korea, Gwangju, calmer." And this reflects something that that is in another document written by him, which is why I think this is his handwriting and his document. I do want to point out that later in the day on the 23rd, the president attended a lunch, as did many of his staff and cabinet, for the Olympics. And it was actually a fundraiser. So while this tragedy was taking place in Gwangju, President Carter was fundraising for the Olympics and not making any statements or doing anything to stop the violence. The New York Times was starting to keep tabs on what was happening in Gwangju, and there are actually quite a lot of articles from about May 17th until the end of the month that have bits and pieces of information, some of which seem to have come from the White House or the cabinet, and some of which seem to come from reporters who were in the area but not actually in Gwangju itself. You can see here in this secret, now declassified document that the U.S. posture toward the situation in Gwangju, it was agreed that we do not need to do more than we have done up to now. And at this point, they were aware of the bloodshed and what was happening in Gwangju, and there was no directive from the White House or from the cabinet to tell the Koreans to stop or to pull back. One interesting outcome of the American discussions relating to the Gwangju Uprising and to the political situation at the time is that almost immediately after the uprising occurred and was stopped, there were U.S. economic interests that were put into place, such as John Moore, who was president of the U.S. Export-Import Bank. He was arranging financing for some huge projects in Korea, one of which was a big housing project. It was low-income housing that was scheduled to be built just outside Gwangju, and in fact was begun that summer. And I have not yet been able to delve into that, but certainly it does make me wonder if these projects were somehow connected to the United States' attitude towards what Chun was doing. This is Ambassador Gleistein, and I just want to point out that according to him, the United States, this is on May 23rd, the United States is doing all it can to help in the restoration of order. We issued a statement in Washington which had the approval of 3 cabinet-level officials. So even if President Carter wasn't in on the meeting, we have to assume that somehow he sanctioned this, but he also had knowledge of what was happening. President Carter went on Face the Nation on May 30th, and he was asked why the U.S. commander approved the use of the troops in Gwangju. And his response was, General Wickham has no authority over how the national authorities of Korea use their armed forces for tasks unrelated to the defense of Korea against external aggression. Chun and his people tried to claim that the instigators of the uprising were in fact from North Korea. We know this is not true. There were no North Koreans doing anything like this in South Korea at the time. So that is either something that was understood to be not true by the Americans, or some of them did in fact believe it but had no first-hand or even second-hand knowledge other than being told by Chun's people that was the case. Again, Ambassador Gleistein didn't send anybody, nor did General Wickham. They didn't send anybody down to Gwangju to actually see what was happening, so they could have no idea of whether or not there were North Koreans there. And while it is true that the United States had no control over how the Koreans used their military, we did have control over whether or not to release those special forces, and we did allow those special forces to go to Gwangju. And this is just making it clear that Ambassador Gleistein did in fact get his knowledge secondhand and thirdhand, and that he did not know himself what was going on. It's also important to note that there were American Peace Corps volunteers who tried to get information to the embassy in Seoul, and they were told it wasn't necessary. On May 26th of 1980, Yoon Song-hwan sent a message to the Americans in Seoul and asked for Ambassador Gleistein to send someone to Gwangju to try to mediate the situation. He got no answer. The next day was the Chun government's final push, where the military came in and they went straight to the headquarters of the provincial office at 3 a.m. and gunned down everybody who was in the building. And Yoon was one of the people who was killed. So the 27th was the last day of the uprising. On May 29th, the Americans were trying to do some damage control because the world started to find out what had happened, and immediately questions were raised. Note that one of the things he said, we realized the situation had to be controlled. And that basically was an explanation for the laissez-faire attitude of the United States government. In an interview with CNN on May 31st, that was broadcast on June 1st, which was actually the first day of CNN's broadcasting, President Carter was asked about Gwangju just for just a minute or two, but he said, security interests must sometimes override human rights concerns. His answer caused a bit of a stir because in the summer of 1979, he had actually gone to Korea and met with Park Chung-hee, and he had given some hints to the Koreans that he felt that their human rights abuses were something that had to be curtailed if we were to continue our relationship amicably. And so when President Carter made this statement less than a year later, many Koreans were very upset because it was like he was saying that the human rights of people in Gwangju were just not that important. So the question is, what could the U.S. have done? It's a fair question, and it's something that obviously has to be considered. So one thing, for my mind, and the thing that is quite important to me, is that they didn't investigate what was actually happening. They could have sent people down there. They could have sent their own people. They could have sent Koreans. They could have sent people from the embassy. They could have sent somebody from the U.S. military to find out what was going on before deciding to release the 20th Division. That did not happen. Kim Dae-jung, who was one of the protesters and eventually became president of Korea in 1992, issued a statement in which he himself said that the American attitude was partly responsible for the massacre that took place in Gwangju during those days. We could have not reversed our previous stance on promoting human rights. We could have insisted that the military not be sent to Gwangju. We could have just said no. We don't know what would have happened if we had done that, but it's something that we could have done. We could have imposed economic sanctions, such as not allowing John Moore to bring funding for the projects that he was looking into in Korea. We also could have pulled out on other projects or said we were going to reduce funding for some things. We could have threatened to curtail arms sales and military support. So there are things that we could have done to put pressure on Chun not to bring the military into Korea, into Gwangju, especially once the Americans knew that people were being murdered by the Korean military. So the takeaway for all this, one thing that we don't know for sure is how many people were actually killed during the Gwangju Uprising. And the reason for that is because there are reports that soldiers piled bodies into trucks and drove them out of town and buried them in mass graves or actually burned them. And there are some people who are just not accounted for, and no one knows where they are or where their graves may be. So the guess is somewhere between 500 and 2,000 people, but it's likely we will never know how many people were actually killed in Gwangju at this time. It is also important to make it clear that the responsibility for this lies with Chun Doo-hwan. But the soldiers under his control reacted with the mindset of mob mentality and actually had been trained to fight North Koreans. These special forces were very specially trained to use extreme violence. So he knew this when he was sending these troops, when he chose to send these troops to Gwangju, he knew exactly who he was sending. These last few photographs that I'm showing to end my presentation are taken from the days of the uprising. Here are some of the taxis that were used to block the streets. This is a bus that was commandeered by some of the protesters, and you can see that they're not doing anything violent. This is a building where the windows were riddled with bullet holes that could only have been reached by helicopter, which helps to prove that helicopters were used. This is a group of men. I don't know if they were shot, but it's likely that they were. This is a famous photograph, and the woman is the mother of the young girl in the picture. She was a 17-year-old high school student who was shot and killed. She wasn't doing anything. She was just on the street and she was shot. This photograph is one of the ones that's most poignant for me because it's shoes of people who were either taken or killed by the military. And you can actually see, if you look closely, that there's a sandal that's a little bit raised in the air as if it was just kicked off somebody's foot. And that's quite poignant. And this photograph is what I will use to end my presentation today. And to me, it exemplifies the big question of the uprising, which is why. Why did this happen? And we have this, this little 2-year-old boy who's looking up at a soldier as if he's saying, I don't understand why you're here. What are you doing in my town? So thank you everyone for listening. I appreciate your time, and I hope that you will look into the Gwangju Uprising yourself and learn more about it. And I'm hoping that the questions I've raised will someday have answers. Thank you so much.